is part of the Center for the Scholarship in the Public Interest's commitment to sustaining democratic dialogue in an age when truth is under siege, democracy is in retreat, and education is under assault by authoritarian forces. In developing this speaker series, we sought someone who places a premium on social and economic justice, raises disquieting questions, makes power accountable, defends democratic values, takes political risk, and exhibits the moral courage necessary to confront pressing social issues, particularly at a time when democracy is being hollowed out by an emerging fascism. It's therefore a great honor to welcome Richard D. Wolff, a scholar whose work exemplifies how education in its broadest and most vital sense must remain inseparable from politics. Educated at Harvard, Stanford, and Yale, Professor Wolff has emerged as one of the most original and courageous economists of our times. His analysis challenges the orthodoxies that sustain capitalism's cruelties and exposes the ideological machinery that makes inequality appear natural and inevitable. Through his work on class, power, and democracy, he shows us that economics is not a neutral science, but a political and moral terrain, a field of struggle that shapes how we understand the very nature and the meaning of freedom. Yet, Professor Wolff is not only a brilliant economist, he's one of the great public intellectuals of our age. He moves fluidly between the classroom and the public sphere, bringing complex economic ideas to wider audiences through his lectures, interviews, and his long-running program, of course, Economic Update. His voice has become indispensable on platforms such as Democracy Now!, the Real News Network, and other venues where critical thought still matters. In almost every setting, he reminds us that the economic forces shaping our lives are not a luxury, and are essential to understand them, both in terms of survival and, of course, in terms of freedom. His work makes clear that education, whether in schools and communities or through culture, must both enable democracy and defend it. He reminds us that teaching, dialogue, and public engagement are moral and political acts. They prepare us to see the world as it is, to question why it is so, and to imagine, of course, how it might be otherwise. His insistence on linking economic to ethics and theory to everyday life restores, in my estimation, the emancipatory power of knowledge. He not only enables the antithesis, he not only embodies the antithesis of intellectual accommodation, he represents a new kind of public and critical intellectual. In my mind, he combines the investigative tenacity of I.F. Stone, whose exposés of government deception and anti-war essays in the 1960s remain legendary, with the moral and political imagination of C. Wright Mills, who rejected the role of what he called a sociological bookkeeper, and instead on being mutinous and utopian, a term that certainly applies to Rick. Like Stone, Professor Wolff addresses social issues in their totality and examines how they are lived by the most affected, yet often disappeared from public discourse. He focuses on both the working class, routinely dismissed as collateral damage, and the architects of inequality who almost always operate in the shadows of power. His analysis of the relationship between capitalism and fascism is groundbreaking work, and understanding how the social, ecological, and moral crises define our time. He's a prolific author with more than 45 books to his credit. His writings have transformed how we think about capitalism, and particularly how it morphs into fascism, both historically and in contemporary life. His most recent book, Understanding Capitalism, continues this project, offering a powerful, accessible, and uncompromising critique of an economic system that concentrates wealth and power in the hands of a financial elite while deepening staggering levels of inequality. For instance, think about the fact that children in the United States have become the barometer of collapse under neoliberal capitalism. Nearly 11.4 million children live in poverty, with Black, Latino, and Indigenous children facing poverty rates 2 to 3 times higher than white children. This is in the United States, the richest country in the world. 150,000 children live on the streets any given night in the US. Rick makes clear that a system built on criminogenic behavior of the billionaire class cannot be redeemed. It must be dismantled and replaced with economic arrangements rooted in democracy and the common good. At a time when the public discourse is poisoned by propaganda, civic consciousness is in crisis, and public institutions are being hollowed out, Rick's voice reminds us that to think critically is in itself revolutionary. His vision of economic democracy offers not only an alternative to capitalism's brutality, but a renewal of hope, the belief that collective struggle, informed by knowledge and guided by civic responsibility, compassion, and the pursuit of justice, freedom, and equality, can still reclaim the future. Please join me in welcoming Professor Richard Wolff.
Thank you very much, Henry. I'll try very hard in what I have to say to live up to so generous an introduction. It's very, very kind of you. I only wish, as I mentioned earlier, that my mother was here so she could see it and believe it for herself. All right, I am speaking to you from New York City, where I live and where I work. And as I also mentioned before we began, I am talking to you at a time that may help you understand some of those kind things that Henry just said about me. Because I know that I am carried along by this society much more than I do to shape it. And that is true of all of us. And we are now at a point in this country of the most fundamental crisis that I have ever seen, that I ever expected to see in the United States. To be honest with you, if I had been asked, I would imagine that the things I'm about to describe would be happening in the future, but frankly, I did not expect to live to see them. Very quickly, then, because it'll introduce my topic for the evening. The city of New York, a few days ago, elected a socialist Muslim to be the mayor of the city of New York. Now, had I uttered that sentence 6 months ago, it would have been greeted by the laughter of such an outlandish joke. Now that joke has become the reality. And keep that distinction in your mind, the difference between an unbelievable joke and then it becomes reality, because we're going to have a lot of that in the months and years ahead. Why did Mr. Mamdani win the election? Because the mass of the people of New York, and just so you know, he won with over 50% of the vote, which means he got more votes than the Republican and the Democrat and the other combined. He walked away with one of the biggest victories any mayor has received in the city of New York. How is this possible? A man who took a strong position on the Palestine-Gaza issue, who did not run away from the label socialist, who did not run away from the identity as a practicing Muslim. These are remarkable things that any politician in America would dare to do, and he did them all. And he got the biggest victory any of the socialists who have been increasing in number here in the United States since Bernie Sanders ran for president back in 2015, 10 years ago. So now I can tell you that this is a country that is changing. And these elections and the return of the socialism that was before World War II an important part of American life and history, long delayed by the Cold War, but now returned, is just part of the enormous changes. The empire of the United States is in decline, also for 10 or 15 years. Nor are these two things not related. They are related. I want to remind you, please, with me, the United States went to war in Vietnam. The other side was the Communist Party of North Vietnam. And here we are many years later. Who runs that country? The Communist Party of North Vietnam, because they won and the United States lost. Much later, the same kind of game played out between the United States and the Taliban in Afghanistan. Who rules Afghanistan now? The Taliban, because the United States lost. It lost in Iraq, and it is in the process of losing in Ukraine. This is very important information. But perhaps even more important is the fact that the United States and its major allies, the so-called G7, are now in aggregate a smaller economic unit than is the people of the People's Republic of China and their BRICS allies. This actuality has not yet sunk in to the United States, even though the consequences of it are washing across our culture, our politics, our economics, everything. It is a time of extraordinary change. The extraordinary position of the United States coming out of World War II, when every other major potential competitor had destroyed each other. Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, gone. Russia, China, badly wounded. Nobody in a position to oppose in any way. So the United States filled the vacuum. The British left their empire, the Americans moved in. And for the next 70 years, it was Pax Americana. Militarily, politically, economically, the dollar becomes the world currency, the US dollar, and so on. All of that is either gone or declining, without exception. What does that do? Well, if I had more time, I would go into many of the things it's doing, because it's changing our politics literally all the time. But I want to look at one particular thing with you because of what Henry has done in his lifetime that has been important to many of us here in the United States, to your interest in the humanities, in education. I want to talk about how we go about thinking through the issues that surround us. Something so specially important now that things are changing so fast. Frightening changes, yup, but big opportunities also. Those two things usually go together. So I want to turn to something that you might think of as arcane philosophy, a special branch of philosophy called epistemology. But the words don't matter. Here's the idea. We're trying to make sense of what is changing all around us. There's a special extra urgency to understand what's going on, whether you're trying to make a decision about what courses to take in your education, or what career to pursue, or where to live, or how to live. You're trying to understand the environment in which you're going to live your life. So I want to take a moment out to talk about understanding what it means to construct a knowledge of something, to learn something, to explain to yourself and to others what's going on. You might think explanation is a straightforward thing. It isn't. It never was. There have been moments in human history when people stopped explaining events and turned inward to ask and answer the question, what exactly are we doing when we explain something? Because if you're not clear about that, if you don't understand the process of understanding, you're going to go in a fuzzy direction at best. So bear with me a few minutes when I try to make one clear point. In the education I got here in the United States, where I was born and have lived all my life, I early on came to understand, vaguely, dimly, that I was being told that this or that is the truth, singular, the truth. And the teachers who meant well told me what the truth was. And if I got it wrong, they corrected me so that I wouldn't make a mistake and think in some way that wasn't the truth, which is what I was taught to aspire to capture, to articulate, and to treasure. They meant well. They thought there was a singular truth. When I got older, I learned that this was an inheritance from a religious background in virtually all the people who had taught me, my family included. If you believe in most religions, there is an authority within them that articulates the truth. And for the convenience of us mere mortals, it's often written in a book. The Quran, the Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament, whatever. And it is a repository of the truth. And then when I got a little older and wiser, someone put into my hands a book by a man named Hegel, and everything changed. As he explained to me, now in my words, of course, not his, that human beings, when they think, when they try to explain anything, why they don't feel well that day, why they like this person but not that one, why they decided to marry her and not the other one, etc., etc. All the important and not so important things we explain. When we explain, we, the person who's doing the explanation, is interacting with what is to be explained. Why I like chocolate, not vanilla. We interact. We literally make sense of a feeling, of a preference, of an experience, of an event, of an act, of a crisis. We interact with the world. And how do we do that? Well, Hegel goes through great detail. He says we use our five senses, our eyes, our ears, our taste, and all the rest of it, our touch, and we gather information through our senses. And then we process it with our brains. We process it. We take material in and we process it to make up truths, statements about the world, explanations about what's going on. And here comes the punchline. We don't all do that in the same way. I do it because I had a particular woman as a mother. You didn't have that woman as a mother. You had another woman as a mother, and she was different from my mother, and she shaped your sensitivities and your dreams and your hopes and your brain in her way, like my mother shaped mine. We don't interact with the world in the same way. We couldn't if we wanted to. We make an irreducibly different sense of how the world works. We look at the world differently. If our brains let us, we see some things and we don't see others. You ever had that experience? Go to a film, a movie with a friend, you sit right next to each other in the auditorium, you watch the same movie, and you come out and each of you starts talking, and suddenly you look at one another and the following sentence emerges. My God, were you in the same film that I was just in? Because you saw so different things. But that isn't unusual. That's the way it always is. Even if it makes you nervous to think about that, the reality is we process the world differently. We always did. Human beings always did. So, what then is the truth? Here comes the punchline number two. There is no such thing. Truths only appear plural, lots of them. And that has been a problem for human beings from the beginning. And one of the ways, not the only one, not always the one, but one of the ways to deal with it is to make a kind of unspoken deal with one another. Okay, the truths are different, but that's impossible. I don't know how we can live if we all make a different. Let's agree to think this way. Okay, I understand. That's an accommodation. That's a way for people to get together. They can decide to agree on something, knowing full well that they don't. By the way, if you haven't figured that out, that's already happened to all of you. You've all had that moment, for example, in romantic relationships, where you discover that what one of you thought, the other one didn't think the same way, even though you thought you had agreed on that, but you didn't really, and you never will. And you have to live with that. But the world is very uncomfortable with what I just said. If you've never read Hegel, that's one of the reasons why. Because the people who read him and figure out what it is he's teaching, it's a little much. And so you, if you're like me, have grown up in a world I want now to challenge. There isn't a single truth. What we were told was the truth was one truth, and that's fine. Some people together or separately came up with an explanation. They used their brain, no question. They came up with something where the facts and the thinking and it worked together to produce a coherent story about something. Yes, the problem is there were always other stories that other people were telling and conducting and organizing at the same time. The real question always was, how do you deal with the multiplicity of different truths about everything? You can make a temporary agreement. We're going to go with this one. We know there are others. We know there are different ways of understanding this, but practically we got to get some things done. So we're going to go with this one. But we are always open, if we understand this, to the other way of thinking, to the other ways of thinking, to the other truths that are not false. They're different from yours. And that difference is irreducible. Even if you kill the people you disagree with, the disagreement, which was shaped in those people, is busy being shaped in other people. And who are you going to kill? Everybody? Why do I pick that scary idea? Because that's what we've been doing. That's what we did. We, the people of this planet, constantly making this fundamental error, thinking that the way you deal with different thinkings, different knowledges, different truths is to come up with the answer, which one is the right one? Folks. Suppose I asked you this question. What's the right way to eat your meal? Knife and fork, or fingers, or chopsticks? you'd make fun of me because you don't think the right way is an appropriate way. You want to appreciate, I hope, that these are different ways of eating. They make for a different eating experience, which one you use. That the question, which is the right one, is a stupid question to which you're not going to waste time coming up with an answer. You see, you already understand that there's a situation where right and wrong don't belong, where difference is where the process stops. Now, you can ask, what are the consequences of these differences? How is a meal eaten with your fingers different from a meal eaten with knife and fork? Sure, I'm in favor of that. Let's look at the different consequences of different ways of thinking. If we do that, I think we will solve many of the problems that seem so difficult for the world to solve. And I'm going to end with a couple of examples. For the last 75 years, here in the United States, I am not speaking about Canada, about which I don't know. But here in the United States, where I have lived these last 75 years, I can assure you that we were told over and over again that there is a great struggle going on between capitalism and socialism, or sometimes capitalism and communism. And then our teachers proceeded, as the majority of Americans still do, to explain to one another, sometimes with sophistication, often not, why one of them works and the other one doesn't. Or one of them is true and the other one is false. Or one of them is efficient and the other one isn't. That's all nonsense. It always was. It's that failure to understand that different people see the world in different ways. If you insist that yours isn't just yours, and therefore perfectly interesting and valid and has its opportunity to be articulated, and you can try to convince others, all of which is good, perfectly fine. But if you take another step and say yours is the truth, singular, you thereby banish all the others into the realm of falsehood. That should sound familiar. Somebody's in heaven and somebody's in hell. Somebody's good, somebody's bad. That's not the way the world works. And when you do that, you end up putting people into concentration camps and killing them and having warfare in which you try desperately to reassure yourself that you're on the right side. What you should have done is realized that if you're in Western Europe, you look at Ukraine one way, and if you're in Russia, you look at Ukraine in a different way, and you got to work those differences out. Not make war on one another. It doesn't solve that dilemma. I plead with you about this now. I could give you, from my specialty, economics, countless examples, but I'm going to pick just one. Why is private enterprise in our capitalist system featured over public enterprise, enterprise run by the state or by collectives of people, rather than being individually owned? Individual ownership is one way to organize an enterprise, no question. Collective is another way to organize. Is one of them true? Of course not. They're different. Why would you even ask the question, is one of them true? It's a question that makes no sense to me. You know what it's like? It's like asking me, which is heavier, Tuesday or Friday? And then you would explain to me the category heavy doesn't go with days. That makes no sense to ask which is heavier. That's right. It makes no sense to me to ask which of these two, capitalism, socialism, which is good or right, or none of it. They're different. And what some of you will say, well, you can measure how efficient they are. I remember when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989 and 90, I must have read 50 papers and 20 books explaining to me that the Soviet Union collapsed because it wasn't efficient. And the United States didn't because it was. That's ridiculous, folks. You know why? Efficiency is an idea where you do the following. Something is efficient if the good consequences that flow from it are greater and larger than the bad ones. We tell a story that a business decides to expand if they can make more money by expanding than if they don't, because it's an efficient allocation of resources, is how we say it. But of course, to know what the consequences are of any act, raising an interest rate, investing in an expansion of your factory, taking a course in something, to know whether it's an efficient decision or not, you'd have to know all of the consequences that flow from it. And you'd have to weigh the good ones against the bad ones. And you would do the thing if the good ones outweighed the bad ones. But here's a problem. Many of the consequences will not happen until the future, which you cannot know now. So anyone who has told you, I checked and a one is more efficient than the other, is talking nonsense. You can't do that. No one ever did that. Efficiency is exactly today what turning to the good book has been for the great religions of the world. You go to page 206, and there's the truth. If you believe the one, you'll make sense and believe the other. I don't. I think it is extremely dangerous. It leads people to have a notion that they are in touch with the absolute truth. And it's much safer for the human race if we all learn to respect and deal with the multiplicity of truths amongst us. Let's learn from how each of us makes sense of the world, rather than dictating which is the right one. Unspeakable damage has been done by us to us as a human race by this mistake, by this tendency to need to have an absolute standard of the truth. You don't know the future. You can't. And you therefore cannot know the present, because the present is just like the future. You only have access to some of it. You can't know it all. That's why human beings are so taken with God. God is somebody who knows it all, which none of us can do. What is the punchline of all of this? We will go into very dark places as the empire of the United States declines. Here in the United States, I can tell you, every time I explain to people what they already know, that every empire the world has seen has been born, evolved over time, and passed away. The American Empire, we know when it was born, and we know that it evolved. So the only remaining phase is to pass away. The question was always only when, not whether. And we now answer the question when with the word now. We are going through that in the United States. And as you have learned more in the last 8 months than perhaps you've ever learned it before, we're taking Canada with us. You are not immune to what is going on here. Not perhaps in the ways you might have hoped. And it's not happening for us in the ways we hoped either. But we are aware that everything is now up for rethinking. What is the future of the economic system? The people of New York want us to explore socialism. And that's a lot of people, 9 million. Biggest city in the country, a global capital, as you know. This is a straw in the wind. This is a typhoon in the wind. It's changing everything. Everyone is wondering. Our president is taking steps that you should recognize are the steps of a leader who is desperate. These are not the behaviors of a leader who's in charge, much as he likes to portray himself that way. For the last 100 years, this country has had a drug problem. And the drug problem includes a traffic in drugs, people who make a living buying and selling drugs. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. It has crossed the border into Canada for sure. We arrest people in the United States, as a matter of course, every day who are doing drug traffic. Under the United States system, they are given a lawyer if they can't afford one. They have a chance to confront the evidence. They can present their case to a jury and a judge. And in the event that they are found guilty, which some are, they are punished with a certain amount of time in jail. The capital punishment, killing people, does not apply in the United States. We don't kill people who are convicted of drug traffic. How then can you understand that over the last 3 months, the President of the United States and his Secretary of War have killed 76 people in boats in the Caribbean and on the Pacific side of Latin America? The President tells us that they were in the drug trade. Well, we used to have the American Navy board a ship like that. If they find drugs, confiscate them and arrest the people. But we're not doing that suddenly anymore. And these are little boats, 1,000 miles away. They represent no imminent danger to the United States whatsoever. But we don't give them arresting, a lawyer, a jury, a judge. The President of the United States executes them. And it persists now for months. The whole country is in a state of trying to make sense. What is happening here? In its way, it is as overwhelming as the election of Zoran Mamdani in the mayoral race in New York. So I want to end by pleading with you. Open up your brain to thinking about how the issues you've always thought about, the issues you learn about at McMaster or elsewhere, are really a collection of multiple truths developed out of different ways of thinking. In one way of thinking, the capitalist system that is fading now, friends, is wonderful, and it will be a great loss if it disappears. But there are other ways of thinking where that is not the case, where it wasn't wonderful and its passing will be celebrated. And that's not because people are perverse, it's because they see and understand the world differently. And if you've been understanding the world in a certain way, and the world is unkind to you, lets you see that this way of thinking is leading most of the people who look at it that way to behave in ways you don't want to have anything to do with, then ask yourself whether your brain is open enough to realize that if you don't want to go along with where this society is going, maybe what you need to do is investigate some of those other ways of thinking about the world, other truths about it. A majority of the people of New York City, to the amazement of everybody in the city, just finished doing that. Living in New York over the last 75 years, or some part of that, the way that the capitalist system of New York evolved led the 50% of our people in this city to say, I don't want that anymore. And yes, whatever they might have thought about a Muslim or a socialist, they've had it with this capitalist system. They are beginning to say, what can you tell me about this other way of thinking, an other way of organizing social life? I don't know if they will be convinced. They certainly aren't yet. The vote we just had was a very clear vote against the status quo, a demand for change, and a demand for big changes. How that will evolve, we will all be witness to it. But if I can leave you with this, one of the ways you, each of you, can make a contribution to sorting our way through this period of fundamental historic change that we're living through and will, for the foreseeable future, be living through. One of the ways you can contribute to it is stop being trapped in the notion of a singular truth that you've got to go find and then salute. There is no such thing. There are multiples, and you'll do much better learning about them, evaluating them, choosing among them those you prefer to align with, but never with the idea, I picked the right one. You pick the one that works for you, with respect for the others for whom something else works. And if you're left with wondering, how then do you choose among them? Here's the answer Hegel offered. You ask the question, what are the consequences of different ways of thinking? Let me look at what the people do who think this way. Let me look at what the people do who think this other way. And let me decide where I go based on what the consequences seem to be of thinking that way. Then I think we have a much better chance to come out of this period of history looking back on it as an opportunity more than a catastrophe. Thank you very much.
Okay. Do we have any questions that have come in, Christy, for Rick? Okay, let me begin with a question, Rick, if I may, that I think in some way I want to hope adds to what you've been talking about, and that is that, I'm often moved by how Hannah Arendt talked about the notion of thoughtlessness, and how this notion of thoughtlessness basically was part of the essence of fascism. The inability to maybe understand not only difference, so that was certainly part of it, but the inability to understand the consequences of what these different positions are. And I guess what I'm wondering is, there's a line that comes from Baldwin where he says, ignorance aligned allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have. And I guess your talk raises a lot of those questions for me. But what I don't understand in terms of what's missing, I think, is the way in which certain institutions really define what's possible to think. And so they become larger battlegrounds, not just simply around the question of eliminating difference, but they become battlegrounds in some cases of eliminating the very notion that truth is worth pursuing in the first place. So it's not just a question of difference for me, it's a question of whether or not people can distinguish good from evil, which doesn't have to, it seems, become part of some absolutist narrative. So I guess I'm trying to figure out where the notion of institutions come into play here, where the notion, how does that relate to how education is massively under siege at the moment in a way that almost no other institution is? And what does it mean to say to young people, well, you know, yes, there are different views and learn to think differently, when in fact they're going to be punished for thinking differently.
That's right. Yes.
So this isn't a matter of just simply glorifying Hegel. It's a matter of understanding how power and privilege work, both in how we think about difference and truth, and what possibilities exist for making those differences public or those positions and acting on them, when in fact I could go to jail or be fired for those positions. If you believed in the United States that the pro-Palestinian movement was worthwhile, you could lose your job, you could get doxxed, you could lose your career, you could lose your life. And now in the United States, there are certain positions who are fighting for democracy and not just saying they're for difference. What they're saying is like democracy matters, and they're being thugged and being arrested and being abducted. So I'm trying to understand where power comes into play in your argument.
Well, let me respond from my own discipline, economics. So, as you kindly mentioned in your introduction, I'm a product of the elite school universities of the United States. I spent 10 years of my life in those elite Ivy League universities. And I was taught what we call neoclassical economics. It is a particular way of understanding what an economy is, how it works, why it has the consequences it does. There was no effort, I want to make this clear, to question the foundations of this approach, to teach us alternative approaches, nothing. In the 10 years, 2 semesters a year, so 20 consecutive semesters of my education in economics, in only one of those 20 semesters was I presented with reading that was critical of either capitalism or the neoclassical way of thinking about it. I did have one teacher who gave us a little bit of the work of Karl Marx. 19 semesters of endlessly working in and with neoclassical, and about a quarter of one semester to read the opposite. Okay? Here's what that taught all of the students in the room, not just me. If you want a career in this profession, here is what you do. You do this, because this is for all practical purposes the truth. No one had to say it that way. It wasn't necessary. That came across between the lines, if you like. And it means, and I say this literally so you all understand, 95 or 96% of the courses in economics taught in the United States are taught that way now. And they have been for the last 60 years. One of the reasons this country is in trouble is it has no serious engagement on the part of its economists with alternative ways of thinking, alternative ways of understanding the problem, alternative ways of solving the problem. Nothing. Our pathetic decline is in part our own fault. It's the result of so narrow an education, so narrow a way of thinking that you can't cope. And the power structure of our society has made the decision to keep it that way. By the way, a decision which a few among them worry about. They're not all of the same, they have their differences too. There are a few, but the overwhelming dominant view governed by the business community that sits on the board of directors of most of our universities, they want young people who think in a certain regimented way. The same business leader who gives a speech on the 4th of July about the importance of diversity of opinion does not allow it in the American education system. And they don't even understand the laughable contradiction that they embody when they behave like that. But that is the norm in our society. And I think it would be harder to sustain that power, that way of using power, if there were a better understanding that there is no singular truth and that the arrogation to themselves by one theory that they are the truth and everybody else can be neglected, can be ignored, can be repressed. That's a big problem. We prepare the way for our own undoing, those of us that are critics, those of us that are not part of the mainstream, by allowing this notion of truth and falsity, because it'll be used by those in power to call us weird, strange, and all the other words that our people like me have been called. And if you're wondering how do I say it, because I'm the contradiction here. Every time I have been in trouble because I'm interested in Marx or I'm interested in social criticism, I've waived my pedigree. And when I waive my pedigree, the people who want to bother me back away. And so I've been able to do it in a way others haven't, not because I'm right or wrong and none of that. It's a power matter. It has to do with the structures. You're quite right. But one of the ways you undermine the existing power structure is to take away the epistemological ground on which it sits.
We have some questions for some students, if you don't mind. We
Oh,
don't want
please.
to keep it too long. I mean, one of the things that we've grappled with, certainly in my courses, is trying to, in some way, deepen and understand some of what you're saying by making it clear that we believe, and I think you would, that education is really central to politics.
Yes.
So we're not just talking about, what it means to recognize difference and to understand the truth and its consequences, which I love in your work, the consequences of certain truths.
Yes.
But the question that one of my students is asking, he says, if I may read it to you, he
Please.
says, this is from Jesse Generove. He says, if sense making is shaped by material conditions, how can education help us to remake those conditions instead of just adapting to them? As in, how do we structure education in cultural institutions? I mean, what is given your position, what is it, given the attack on education that's taking place, that needs to be done to allow them to in some way really become democratizing agents that enable people to expand their imaginations, think differently, and be able to understand the consequences of different positions? What needs to be done here?
Okay. Let me begin. I'll take a risk, but knowing that they're your students, Henry, I know I'm not taking too big a risk. And to quote Karl Marx, he believed in something called the dialectic. By all means, material conditions shape the way we think. But he was the first one, with being a student of Hegel, to insist that the dialectic goes the other way as well. How we think changes the material conditions. And we have to understand that education is the process of developing how we think. Yes, we do it under the influence of the material conditions. But if we're aware of the dialectic, then we know that we as thinking people can use our cerebral processes to change the material world. I'll give you an example. The material world of capitalism is organized as follows. In every factory, store, or office, with few exceptions, there's a tiny group of people at the top, the owner of the business, the board of directors if it's a corporation, and all of that. A tiny group of people who make all the key business decisions. The vast majority of the people, the employees as opposed to the employers, are excluded from those decisions. That's a very particular way of organizing production. And you know what it teaches the vast majority of people? Passivity. You don't have any power. You're not given any power. Now along comes the educated person who can think his or her way through and realize there's nothing necessary about a top down hierarchical organization of the workplace. It could be a democratic community that organizes the workplace. And if it were, it would demand of everybody equal participation in all the big decisions, what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the product. And if you did that at the workplace, of course, people would demand it in the community. We have the opposite because you don't have it in the workplace. You don't think about demanding it anywhere else either. So there is a way, if you teach to an educated audience, that a collective democratic way of running a business where we, by the way, those exist. We call them worker co-ops. If we organize business like that, which is being done all around the world in many places, including the United States, we're going to change the material condition, and that is going to change, and they're that dialectic. We change the way the workplace is organized. We change how people learn to think. And as they think in new ways, they'll change the organization of the workplace. In fact, that's where we are. The capitalist workplace is becoming unacceptable to ways of thinking. And the direction towards a socialism of cooperation is one result. Why is it a result? Because educated people have taken their thought in that direction.
Maybe one last thought, Richard, before you go. You know, your friend and certainly my late brother, Stanley Aronowitz, was always concerned about education as I were, and we actually wrote some books together. But I think that one of the things that we were particularly curious about was how certain truths, alleged truths, become normalized by virtue of eliminating every other truth. And in this particular case, we're concerned about four things. We're concerned about the question of historical amnesia and how history as a foundation for arriving at certain positions was being eliminated. And now, of course, you see it in the United States with the attack on the Smithsonian, the attack on memory with banning of books in schools. The other issue was that issues are also usually dealt with individually. They're isolated. There's no comprehensive way of bringing these things together. So people can't translate private issues into larger public considerations. There's no social system there. There's just the dead place of individual morality. All problems are about character, right? And I guess the last thing that we were concerned about that I think relates enormously to what you're saying was the death of morality. You know, you're the economist. I'm not an economist. I study neoliberalism, but I know one thing. I know when neoliberals say things like economic activity is divorced from social cost, that's not only about the death of morality and social responsibility, that's about the death of agency.
Yeah.
And I guess in your discourse, what I'm curious about, which is really something we all can think about again and again, and maybe you might want to comment on this, how do you think, Richard, about how what you're saying would be helpful to talk about the rise of the fascist subject? The fascist subject, like, for instance, Stephen Miller is the personification of the fascist subject, right? In many ways. I mean, what is it about this question of truth and difference and ethics and responsibility that we need to think about to eliminate the subject? I mean, it's from not allowing the no, not eliminating the subject. No, sorry, not allowing the conditions to be created that produce and normalize the subject.
Well, let me give an answer that is partly also a little bit personal for me. Uh, my father was born in Metz, France, and my mother in Berlin, Germany. I was born in Ohio, but I grew up speaking French and German because that was the language of my household. And as I grew old enough, I asked my parents questions about their family. And I learned that there wasn't much family left because they had all been killed in World War II in a variety of concentration camps like Auschwitz and Mauthausen and others. So that all has been very, very close to me, this question that you're asking. And I studied my mother and my father, as children always do. And I tried to understand how my mother was in a concentration camp, so experienced it directly. My father escaped, but his sister didn't, and things like that. And, and I learned something from them. And here's what I learned. Many of the fascists, including many who behaved abominably, were people that my parents and their parents had lived among, grown up with, had love affairs with, and on and on. So they knew these people very well. And so I asked, how do you explain to me, your child, to yourself, what happened here? Because it was a personal loss to them, of a staggering kind. And my father's sister, my aunt, was grabbed by the Gestapo off the streets of Paris and never seen again. If you go through that kind of experience, it forces questions and mental processes on you, whether you like it or not. And here's their answer. The people who became fascists had gone through extremely difficult experiences. And those experiences were processed by mental theories, mechanisms, ways of thinking that led them to become fascist. Didn't have to be. They didn't have to go through those experiences. They didn't have to think in the way that they did. But you put those two together and you produced the fascist mentality. And I want to take a moment to tell you what the experience in Germany was that produced Nazism. The Germans were a disparate group of countries in the 19th century. It took a strong leader like Otto Bismarck to bring them all together into one country, Germany. And that only happened in the second half of the 19th century. They're not very old. And then once it was unified, Germany took off. It became the great competitor to what was then the dominant economy of the world, the British Empire. And the only other contemporary challenge to the British Empire was the United States, that former part of the empire that had gotten independence and was now developing. Germany and America, the two challenges to the British Empire. The Germans could not get over their success. They grew spectacularly. They industrialized. They challenged Britain. Unbelievable. And in a matter of a few decades, wow. They thought they were on their way to once again being the great fantasy Teutonic empire of the past. And then World War I came and they were defeated. They lost. No one had prepared them. Everyone had prepared them to be the next empire of the world. They were crushed. Very important. Everything they believed in was destroyed when that war was lost. But that was only the beginning. 5 years after the war is over, Germany has the worst inflation any country has had in the last century. In a matter of 1 year, it went from 6 Deutschmark to $1 to 12 billion Deutschmark to $1. You understand? Prices doubled every 2 hours for months at a time. All their savings, and they're very frugal people, had been accumulated in the 19th century, wiped out, worth nothing. Then 5 years later, the Great Depression, 1929, hits. And they're wiped out again. You know when Hitler arrives? Right then. Right then, not before. He arrives after those cataclysms had destroyed the German working class, had destroyed all self-image of and they were desperate. They had nothing left. Psychologically, nothing. And they turned to a person who said, "Follow me, I have a solution." And if people think this reminds you of Mr. Trump, good. He's copying that more than he knows, because he's talking to what part of the United States? White, male, Christian factory workers, above all else. The people who were wiped out in the last 40 years of American history as automation took away their jobs for computers, robots, and AI, and relocating to China, India, and Brazil took the rest of their jobs. And now they are greeters at Walmart and have no future, no income, no security, nothing. The American dream that had been proffered to them, that they had promised each other and their children, all out of reach. And they are bitter and they are angry, and no politician talks to them. Everybody keeps making believe that the United States empire is in great shape. It isn't. Everybody's doing well. They aren't. They know it, but their political expression pretends it isn't. So they go with Mr. Trump. Fascists are created by the combination of the material conditions you subject people to and the ways of thinking you inculcate in those people. Those two things together get you a fascist. Remove one or the other, you don't need and you don't get fascism. That's the lesson that has to be learned. Otherwise, we will repeat this experience again.
Okay, Richard, I just want to say thank you so much. I'm waiting for my video to come on, which is not happening. Okay, I'll have to go without it. Oh, nope. All right, listen, thank you, Richard. Thank you so much for the talk. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. And good night.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. And to all of you, thank you for your attention. I appreciate it. I wanted to give you the benefit of what I have learned. I hope some of it got across. And my appreciation again for the opportunity to be with you this evening.
Oh, great. Thank you so much.